I mean, just look at this map. It's insane. It's crazy. It's so much land. What percent of the world did they own in population and land size? I can't even imagine. This is huge. It looks like, half the world, if not more. It's incredible. What a country, like what a powerful country, an influential country throughout these hundreds of years to be able to achieve something like this and just ruling the seas and owning the seas. They dominated the seas. Of course, there's other good powers, but I think it comes down to Britain was number one, and it's kind of common knowledge that they just that they could do all this. Hello, welcome back. Today I'm going to be watching and reacting to every country England has invaded visualized. I've been getting this as a suggestion for a while now, a couple times, and I've been interested in it, and I just never watched it yet. I wanted to kind of give it a fresh first look, and I know the English Empire has been massive back in, I think it was something like 1919 when it was at its height, right after World War I. They owned roughly 25% of the world's population. I think it was like 23% or so. I believe something around 400 million, just over 400 million people were under the British Empire, and it was almost a quarter of the landmass in the world was under their control and under them. And this is going to be a good, perfect visualization to see this over this 12-minute video, and this is by Real Life Lore. Let's find out what every country England has invaded was. And here we go.
For a good chunk of the past few centuries, this music was the final boss music played for people across the entire world. The English and later the British have been responsible for invading and conquering more countries and people than any other nation in human history. And honestly, it's startling just how many places they've been to. In this video, I'm going to do my best at attempting to visualize all of Britain's invasions and conquests for you, continent by continent, in as brief a time as possible. So let's begin with the closest continent to Britain.
And real quick, I'm always impressed. I watched another video about the British Empire and how it kind of came to be. And I was always impressed of how kind of late that this happened, how much they conquered. It makes sense with all the maritime, all the ships and more, I don't know if technology is the right word, but yeah, technology and advancements, which would make it easier to expand an empire. All these things will lead up to it. And I always compare it to past empires which were so long ago, like ancient history a lot of times, like the Romans and the Mongols, even the Napoleonic Wars and the French Empire was nothing near how large this was. It was big, but it wasn't anything like this, and it was, I don't know, what, 80 years, 70 years after that the English Empire kind of reached its peak, which was pretty wild how late that happened. Nowadays, you can never imagine anything like this happening. So that's possibly the last empire, true empire we'll ever see. So just a thought.
Europe. Ireland was the first target of British conquests and was invaded as early as 1169. Within 400 years of gradual conquests, the entire island was ruled by the British and remained that way until most of it was granted independence in 1921. Historically, France has probably been invaded by the English more times than any other country in the world. Just take a look at this huge list.
I'm gonna pause it just to look at this. Yeah, they had many of them. I just did a video on the Hundred Years' War. This seems like throughout history, being an American, maybe, I don't know, maybe people in the UK and Europe as well will think the same thing, but this was they're always at war, it seemed like. I know there's those periods of peace, and sometimes pretty good chunks of periods of peace, but they would always come back and fight in one way or another. They're always battling.
There's not even enough time to talk about a third of these, and for a time, all of this territory inside of modern France was directly controlled by the English, with Calais being the final piece that fell in 1557. Well, except for that time when the British took over Corsica for a couple years. The British continue to invade Spain by the millions every winter, but in the past, they've come with a lot less friendly intentions. English and later British soldiers invaded under the Black Prince in 1363. 1857 and continued on through the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th raids on Cadiz and that time when the British took over Gibraltar and Minorca. They gave Minorca back, but decided on keeping Gibraltar forever. In recent history, the British have invaded Belgium in order to support the Belgians, but that wasn't always the case. They conducted 2 pretty large-scale invasions of modern-day Belgium in 1654 and again in 1701, and Flanders itself was ruled by the English for a few years in the 14th century. The Netherlands was one of England's historical arch-rivals, and so there's been plenty of invasions going in this direction across the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1940, the British technically invaded and took over Iceland peacefully for a year in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Germans. But this was heavily protested by the Icelandic government at the time, so in my books it still counts as an invasion. Italy, of course, was invaded by the British Army during the Second World War as well in 1943, but there were plenty of invasions before then, dating back to Richard the Lionheart's invasion in 1190. Germany, too, was obviously invaded by the British Army in 1945, and northwestern Germany was occupied by the British for 3 years until 1948. But a lot of German territory was ruled by Britain long before then. The islands of Heligoland were British for most of the 19th century, and the Kingdom of Hanover was effectively ruled under a personal union for over a century between 1714 and 1837. Austria was also invaded in 1945, and the southwest of the country was occupied for a decade. Norway was invaded in 1810 and 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars when it was a part of Denmark-Norway because Denmark was aligned to France, so obviously Denmark was invaded during that time as well. Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were all briefly invaded by small units during the...
It's building so fast. I'm trying to wrap my head around it. Just a lot of these I'm trying to figure out. All of these could be, you could watch a whole documentary about it to start to understand each one of these and why they did. Like even like Italy, why did they do that? Or what's the purpose? Who did it? Why did they want it? What would it benefit from? Did they really think they would hold all of these places? Did they only want to push out the current, I don't know, king or queen that was there? I have no idea, but each one of these has their own unique story, like very in-depth story that I probably will never know about, but just interesting, like Estonia and Latvia, stuff like that. Like why? But there's going to be a reason. How many of these they consider that they failed, they lost, or won? I'm not sure.
Crimean War against Russia because they were all part of the Russian Empire at the time, and of course, Russia itself was invaded then too, as well as in 1918 when the British took over a large chunk of northern Russia for a time in their fight against the Bolsheviks. The territory of modern Ukraine was invaded by British Army units during the Crimean War. The British took over the Croatian island of Vis between 1807 and 1814 during their fight against Napoleon. The British Army had boots and guns on the ground in Bosnia recently between 1992 and 95, fighting against the Bosnian Serbs, and around the same time, the RAF also carried out bombing strikes against Serbian Serb targets in Serbia in 1999. Montenegro was briefly blockaded and invaded in 1913 during the First Balkan War. The British owned the westernmost Ionian islands of Greece between 1815 and 1863 before they gave them back, while Bulgaria was invaded and almost entirely occupied by the British Army between 1918 and 1919 at the end of World War I. Cyprus was a British protectorate between 1878 and 1914 when they decided to just outright annex it to piss off the Turks, and it remained annexed until 1960, except for 2 small chunks that are still British today. Turkey itself was massively invaded by the British during World War I, and part of it was occupied between 1919 and 1923. That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to Asia next. Modern-day Israel and Palestine.
One second, let me just go, since that wraps up Europe, I just want to see the final tally right here. It's a lot. It's a lot of Europe. I'm surprised places like Norway and Sweden, and I guess that's Denmark, but they kind of are in that on the south side. I've never been invaded, but maybe they're like, what's up there? They don't know.
1923. That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to Asia next. Modern-day Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan, were British-controlled from the end of World War I to 1948 and 1946, respectively. Lebanon and Syria were both occupied from the Vichy French government briefly during World War II. Iraq was ruled between 1919 and 1932 and invaded again during the Second World War, and again in 1991, and again in 2003. Kuwait was was a colony for over 60 years until 1966. Georgia and Azerbaijan were both invaded and occupied right at the end of World War I for a year. Iran has been invaded at least 3 times, with the most notable example being the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941. Turkmenistan was invaded in 1918 to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading any further. Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot since it's been invaded in 1839, 1878, 1919, and again in 2001. Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman were all controlled by the British until the early...
I'm just on the verge of like smiling, almost laughing, because it's just so crazy. So many places and multiple times. It's not just like, oh, we were in Iran once, maybe twice. No, there's this whole list. And then Afghanistan, there's a whole list. Iraq. It's just, it's wild to think about. They're everywhere. They're so good. Like their Navy, especially back in the day before, World War II, was just so dominant for hundreds of years. And I think they just kind of sailed around. They could do whatever they controlled the seas. They completely dominated the seas, and it shows. It's just wild. It's amusing to me of how many places have been attacked or conquered and bombed by the British. It makes me want to watch a video of the US. We're kind of on the same lines with bombing people and at war with people all the time, even if they're like small, like Somalia right now. I'm sure we have like small teams always there, and many places around the world we're always having, the Navy SEALs doing this operation there, and we're bombing random places here and there. So I would like to see that. It's going to be, I can only imagine, a lot smaller than this, only because the history with the US is a lot less. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years less. But it's just something to think about. And then another side note, Iraq, how it's spelled with a K. Here in the US, we spell it with a Q, IRAQ, but I've noticed IRAK is very common as well. Maybe the rest of the world says it with a K. I don't know. Let me know. But I've just noticed that throughout time. We've always spelled it IRAQ for whatever reason.
1970s, while a chunk of Yemen was controlled for over a century between 1839 and 1967. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were all, of course, invaded many times and outright ruled by the British Empire in parts for nearly 2 centuries.
The British Raj, right?
1757 and 1947. Nepal was invaded in 1814 but never successfully conquered. Bhutan was invaded in 1772 and again in 1864 and was sort of conquered as a protectorate between 1910 and
Sort of conquered?
Burma/Myanmar was invaded in 1826 and was definitely successfully conquered and ruled through 1947. Thailand was briefly invaded in 1945 since they were allied to Japan in World War II, and so was Vietnam in the same year, but that was to support the French government against the growing independence movement. Malaysia and Singapore were each conquered and ruled up until the 1950s and 1960s. Brunei was conquered and ruled up until the 1980s, whereas the Philippines were briefly invaded during the 7 Years' War. China got invaded a lot, and Hong Kong was a colony until as recently as 1997. And while not outright invaded, part of Japan was occupied following World War II between 1946 and 1952. And finally, Indonesia was invaded a bunch during the Napoleonic Wars since it was a Dutch colony aligned to France at the time. Next up, Oceania. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were invaded by the British and established as colonies that each gained independence in 1931. Papua New Guinea was also a British colony for a time, as were the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu.
Of course they are.
Let's move back over to Africa next, which the British have violently visited a lot. In terms of just places the British outright colonized after invasions, there's the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, along with
so much. It's just still crazy, blowing my mind to see how much they've actually conquered at one point, or fought, bombed, whatever it was. And this map is just expanding more and more, way quicker than I could even comprehend to try to understand why anything is. I remember briefly learning about how and why they kind of broke up, chopped up Africa here for, the French, the English, the Dutch, etc. Portugal, I think, had some. There's a few countries that are like the major people that kind of carved up Africa. I'm wondering how they came up with, because this is such an awkward border. It's just very funky to me. I think at one point they went down the Nile and kind of just took land around it, and that's how they kind of expanded. I don't know if that's true, but that's maybe why it looks so awkward starting off. But then it just keeps going and then expands into South Africa and then just random parts around. And I know all the other countries have huge chunks of it around. How did they divide it up? It's another video, but it's just kind of funny seeing these borders.
With parts of modern-day Somalia and Guinea. Senegal was briefly invaded and had some of their coastline taken over in the 1700s, while during the Second World War, the British invaded the French colonies of Djibouti, Madagascar, and Comoros after they aligned themselves with the Nazi Vichy regime, and the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, although they had also invaded Ethiopia much earlier in 1868. And as German colonies right before World War I, the British also invaded Togo and Cameroon without annexing them afterwards. For the final area of the world left to discuss, let's move over to the Americas. All of Canada was a British colony until 1931, while Newfoundland remained until 1949. The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776, and was invaded again in 1812, and the modern states of Oregon and Washington were claimed right up until 1846.
I did not
as
know
far
that
as
for
other
Washington
outright
and
British colonies
Oregon.
here go, there was the Bahamas, Jamaica, Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Besides colonies, Cuba was invaded and occupied during the 7 Years' War in 1762. Haiti was invaded in 1793 during the French Revolutionary Wars. The Dominican Republic was invaded way back in 1655 in an attempt at conquest under Oliver Cromwell. Parts of the east coast of Honduras and Nicaragua were conquered and ruled for nearly 2 centuries until 1819. They sent the Navy to invade Mexico in 1861 to force them to repay some debts, and during the splendidly named War of Jenkins Year, aka the more lame-sounding War of the Austrian Succession, the British invaded a lot of Spain's colonies, including Panama, a huge one into Colombia, and ultimately Peru. In 1796, the British took over Suriname because it was a Dutch colony.
And don't they still own, or it's like under the Commonwealth Suriname? Isn't that still British? Or under them? Something along those lines.
And they were allied with the revolutionary
maybe not
French
anymore.
and later Napoleon. They also invaded Martinique and Guadeloupe because they actually were French during the Napoleonic Wars. Venezuela was invaded in 1902 as part of the so-called Venezuela crisis to force the country to repay some debts they had defaulted on, kind of like Mexico, while Argentina and Uruguay were both invaded during the Napoleonic Wars as well in 1806 when Spain and her colonies were still allied with Napoleon. And that pretty much sums up all of the territory the British have ever ruled and all of the countries this small island has ever invaded. There are a total of 65 countries today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire.
Crazy.
The Empire used...
And that is why, wait, let me go back to this better picture. I wanted to go over another video of, you know, the independence. Like, it was the video that I reacted to earlier, which was really fun, was how do they teach, you know, the American Revolution in Britain and the UK. And that was very kind of enlightening and eye-opening to me. It wasn't overly significant in short to Britain at the time. So 65 countries are now celebrating, you know, their independence away, and, you know, the US is just one of them. But to us Americans, it is such a massive event because it's so big for our country and what it did. You know, for better or for worse, depends on, well, I don't know, who knows. I always thought it would be interesting to watch a video of what if the US never broke off? What would be, you know, I would just assume it would be something like Australia or Canada kind of just gain their independence. Thankfully, we're the best of allies, and we love Britain, and hopefully they generally like at least the people here. So, you know, we're like the best of friends. I love going over there, and everyone's so nice and helpful and fun. Just look at this picture. I love it.
Today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire. The Empire used to rule over a quarter of all the world's land at the same time and was the biggest empire in human history. And in total, today, there have been 117 modern countries that have been aggressively invaded by the British armed forces during some point in their histories, representing a total of 60% of all the world's nations, which is almost the same number of countries that you can watch this video in.
That is crazy. That is absolutely crazy right there. Here's just a map of everything and more little kind of conflicts in South America, some in Asia. I mean, just look at this map. It's insane. It's crazy. It's so much land. It would be interesting to see how much did Britain own, or England, Britain, depending on what time, own at, like, forever. What percent of the world did they own in population and land size? I can't even imagine. This is huge. It looks like, half the world, if not more. It's incredible. Maybe more than half the landmass at one point. Not all together, of course, but just like throughout time. It's just unbelievable. What a country, like what a powerful country, an influential country throughout these hundreds of years, to be able to achieve something like this and just ruling the seas and owning the seas. They dominated the seas. Of course, there's other good powers, but I think it comes down to Britain was number one, and it's kind of common knowledge that that they could do all this and expand and conquer and do whatever they wanted to. This map is where it's at. This is what I wanted to see at the end, and it's perfect. You really get a sense of just their dominance throughout time. No other country is anywhere near this. I know, France would France be second on this list of how much they have owned? Because I know, of course, a lot of Africa. Spain at one point, I believe, or they just put the king's, I don't know what it was, nephew or cousin in, something like that, to kind of rule. I'm not exactly sure if they actually ruled Spain. And I'm sure, many other parts of, Asia and Americas, stuff like that. So I would guess that they would be second as, kind of like this empire at one point or throughout time, I guess, because this is all time. I think France is second, but let me know if I'm wrong with that. And that being said, I'm sure England is, leaps and bounds ahead of them, of what they've been to and conquered and fought in, stuff like that. Overall, this was a great suggestion, so thank you for this. This was very informative. I know they've been around and conquered, fought in so many places around the world. It's not like, they're dominant in one area or Europe. They were everywhere because of their dominance at sea and their knowledge and the new technologies and innovations that were coming up. And they were, front and foremost, like kind of the best in a lot of these areas. Their maps were the best. Everything was it was like their time. It was everything kind of came together, all the stars aligned, and they were able to achieve this. Later on, I think it was 1919 was the peak of their empire at one time. And just after World War I ended, and I think it was like it peaked when they got a little chunk of Germany or something like that. I'm not overly familiar with World War I and the consequences of the losing countries, but I think that was kind of their peak, 1919, when they owned at one point roughly a quarter of the population, a quarter of the land mass. I think it's a slightly less with the population, 23% of the world, 400 and something million people. This shows you a much more expanded view throughout all of time where they have been. And it's amazing to see. Looking back at it, very impressive, no matter where you're from, that they were able to achieve this. And now I'm going to see if there's any good comments, because I'm sure there are going to be a few good ones in here. Here we go. Here's one of them. This explains why my British passport keeps getting rejected at the border. Because of that. I mentioned something like this earlier. Present. America keeps invading everywhere. History. Do you know who your father is? Yeah, that's kind of true. That's where I wanted to see the U.S. standpoint in this, of where we've, now more modern days bombed and invaded and had something to do with it. Probably a lot. I don't even know. Would it be more? I know we have so many little micro battles and wars and Navy SEALs going in random countries doing these operations, but I don't know if it would be this huge. I don't know. I guess it depends on the definition that we are using at the time. Maybe a future video. Wait, if everyone in Star Wars speaks or understands English, what does that mean? Something to think about for the future. Being an American and speaking English, it is nice though to go to other countries like, Europe. They'll teach English there. And a lot of the world will teach English as their second language, which is awesome. And then even pilots, the universal language is of course English. So that makes my life easier when I travel, and it's very convenient, and I'm very thankful for it. So this is a nod to thank Britain for that. The two reactions to this for British people is like, one, yes, that's us with their glasses all cool. That is us. That's my country. And the second one was, oh God, that's us. Uh-oh. So my question to you is, how does this, especially if you're from the UK, if you're British, anywhere really, even if you're in Europe or one of these conquered nations, how does this make you, with keeping it civilized in the comments, but how does it make you feel? Like, what were you feeling when you watched this? I feel like there'd be a sense of, like that one comment said, kind of a sense of like pride, like, yeah, we are the innovators, we conquered, we were so good at this, we were on top of the world, we were the first country, like the best country. But then also you have that more not good feeling part, perhaps, that just, I feel like it's just a different time. I don't know. I don't know how you would feel about this, your thoughts about it. Yeah, mainly just pride and kind of, oh no, like I don't know what you would feel, because I don't live there. I think it's very impressive, but I do understand, of course, these were, wars, and it's not going to be pretty all the time at all. This is history. It's good to learn it, and yeah, you might find pride in it, but it's also kind of like a, sorry guys, sorry everyone, my bad. I don't know. It could just be, yeah, we're the greatest country. It was back in the day, whatever. It's great to see. I'm not sure, but let me know. Let me know that, and anything else that you could add, I would love to hear, because this was a great video. I really liked this one, and I want to please suggest more that are anywhere around these lines. I want to see the US version of this, France, whatever, even Spain. I'm sure there's other versions of this that I would love to watch and pretty much compare to this British rule, this British Empire by 1919 and everything that they've conquered. So until next time, thanks for joining, and I'll see you next video. Let's see how this goes.